Won't you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts find their way into the heart of God this morning. Amen. Last night at about 9:30, I got a call from Robin. It seemed that pretty much her whole household was in the bathroom, and the battle of the stomach flu has not yet worked its way on out. So that sounded like no fun over there. Robin herself has never called in sick to work on a Sunday ever, but she finally had to admit that we really don't need any sermon examples of the exorcist from the high pulpit. Can I get an amen? So she emailed me her sermon notes, and this is a combination sermon, half her, half me, and I wrote it through the night, so I hope you will be a little forgiving. Opening her draft, I read the quote at the top of the page: imposter syndrome, also known as imposter phenomenon, fraud syndrome, or the imposter experience. It's a psychological pattern in which an individual doubts their accomplishments and has a persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. Well, thanks, Robin. Here I stand in your stead, already worrying that folks came to church to hear you, and you've pretty much highlighted my worst fear. You named it. Here I am, the imposter. But all right, she had some great fine points in bullets. So her first point is, God does not call the qualified, God qualifies the called. God doesn't call the qualified. I think I have shared with you before about this, but I grew up with all these messages about my learning disabilities, and that caused me to really never feel smart. I feel even embarrassed to sort of admit aloud that I never ever feel smart. I felt called to ministry, but never smart enough, wise enough, good enough, ready enough. I think Moses, who was called to preach good news, think of him who was called to preach good news, but he refused for a long time because he had a lisp. And I felt like that too. I still feel like that just even every day. I think, oh my goodness, is this who I'm called to be? I can't tell you how many times I felt unqualified for life, yet let alone ministry. Maybe you have that version, some version of that in yourself as well. In divinity school, I began a summer unit doing clinical pastoral education as a chaplain. How green I was. It was about 15 years ago now. I didn't know much of my Bible. I just have to admit that to you all. I had never yet been with someone as they died. I'd never sat with two opposing gangs after a fatal shooting. I'd never advised someone about a DNR, a do not resuscitate order, whether to wear that or not on a wrist. I had never prayed aloud for anyone in my life. It was all brand new in that terrifying way. Yet I loved chaplaincy from the start. People came from all over the world to Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, where I was serving. And in the years I spent there, I met people from every faith background and from every walk of life. I grew so much because I knew so little as a beginner in that way, and all I really had to go on was my gut and every ounce of heart power that I had. So I remember one night that I was asleep and the beeper went off to ask me to come visit a floor on the bone marrow oncology floor 4C. And there's no good call at about 2 a.m. There's only hard times usually. So I went up to be with the family. It turned out it was a man named David who I had visited 5 or 6 times over the past 4 months. More than that, something to the tune of enough to know his secrets, his heartfelt wishes, and his deepest loves. And he loved his family. He wasn't a man who was ready to be near the end of his life at all, and yet cancer is a fiend, and it was coming near his end. So I went up to this floor, and there were 2 children, Jazzy and Isabel, who went by Izzy, and they were really, really terrified of spending time with their dad. He didn't look quite the same anymore. His cheeks were really thin, and he was having to use some oxygen, so he couldn't speak as easily to them. They were really scared. So I spent time with them throughout the rest of the night. And I knew how little I knew because I struggled to find the words, and I did not want to give them answers and fix things for them. There was no fixing that this was a painful, painful thing. And so I did the only thing I could do, which was to follow their lead. And they knew exactly what to do. They pulled the chairs closer, and we went and got white sheets. Well, all sheets in the hospital are white, but sheets, and made a huge fort. And inside the fort, we all made a nest, a cozy nest, a little bit like the penguins in the zoo who knew how to sit and to tend. And they sat in the nest and they told stories. And Jazzy said, I have been practicing for the daddy-daughter dance, and I don't think my dad will be able to come. And Izzy said, I have tap shoes, and they're not with me, but I can still make my feet tap. Do you want to hear? And the 2 of them got up and they tapped out a tap dance, and they basically created a dance. And over the course of an hour and a half or 2, they practiced going towards the room that they were afraid to go into. And they tap danced their way in, and then they'd run shrieking back, laughing and shrieking. So the young people are so smart about how they'll figure out how to address a fear. Ran back, got the tap shoes to, imaginary tap shoes, to be tapping something out, and tapped and crept along the hall. And eventually, we all ended up in the room with David, his wife, and the 2 girls and me. And they were really scared, but they got up onto the bed, and they did this tap dance, and they'd written sort of a love song for him, and they expressed all the things in their heart about love being forever. And I have never been gifted with that feeling of being in the right place at the right time. And it wasn't something I did. It wasn't wisdom that I brought. It really was that there was this moment where young people led, and the Spirit filled the room, and they danced, and everybody wept, but the feeling of love was so big that it filled up our hearts with something that was real. And then we played Morning Has Broken, Cat Stevens, and all 3 of them together, the 2 girls, because it was like 3 in the morning, and David, all curled up in bed and went to sleep. And it was a good night. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking, and very transformative night for me as a witness to this love and connection that they shared with each other. That was the night that I realized I was called to ministry. I was a blubbering mess as I ended up in the elevator, headed back down to the staff room a number of hours later. I knew that I had not been enough or done enough with that family, but I also knew that I had been in the right place at the right time. It wasn't really about me, and yet I had been a part of helping them find one another. And they had had a good goodbye. They had loved so fully, and they had gathered up all the love that was theirs to keep. God doesn't call the equipped. God equips the called. And here's the truth. All of us are called. All of us are called to love. I learned in that moment and in the days and weeks and months to come, mostly through doing things poorly and messing up, and that is still the case. I learned that my passion for connecting with people leads me to try new ways of reaching them. What I try doesn't always work, but the effort reminds me that I do it because I really honestly do care about each person. I believe humans are born with a deep motivation to love one another despite all of our differences. I am still learning, the late author Audre Lorde writes, how to take joy in all the people I am, how to use all my selves in the service of what I believe, how to accept when I fail and rejoice when I succeed. Vocation or calling is not just for ministers or deacons or people who want to become parents. Of course, it's really, it's true that we all yearn and we all need to be of use in the world. We all yearn and need to do work that brings us a sense of meaning and gives something back to the world. The theologian Friedrich Buechner defines vocation as the place where our deep gladness meets the needs of the world. But Buechner says in figuring out what we are to do in this world, we can't start with what the world needs because the world needs everything. Instead, he writes, you start with the soul you were born with, the gifts you were given, what makes you really glad. If we start here with our own gifts and our passions, we'll be much more likely to find our way of giving authentic service to the world. Last week, Mark, our intern Mark, preached on this very topic of call in Worcester, and they loved the sermon, and then they were surprised. They surprised him by insisting mid-service on doing a Q&A right after his sermon. Yikes, trial by fire, right, Mark? Mark was called to run out of the room, but like Moses, he planted his feet, and he did what he was asked to do, even though he was scared. Mark, thank you for being real and for saying yes when people wanted to connect with you, even if it was hard to do or awkward. There is a story I love about Parker Palmer, the Quaker writer and teacher who writes a lot about this idea of vocation or authentic service. He tells a story about how he always thought his love of flight and all things related to it meant he wanted to be a pilot. He was determined to be one, and he felt like a failure when that never came to pass. But he also spent hours as a little kid painstakingly creating books about airplanes and the mechanics of flight with diagrams and installations and illustrations stapled together with decorated covers. He wrote, "Recently, when I found a couple of these literary artifacts in an old cardboard box, I suddenly saw the truth, and it was more obvious than I had imagined. I didn't want to be a pilot. I wanted to be an author, to make books, a task I had been attempting from the 3rd grade to this very moment." Parker says, from the beginning, our lives lay down clues to selfhood and vocation, though the clues may be hard at first to decode. But trying to interpret them is profoundly worthwhile, especially when we are feeling profoundly lost, having wandered or been dragged far away from our birthright gifts. Those clues are helped in counteracting the conventional concept of vocation, which insists that our lives must be driven by oughts. As noble as that may sound, we do not find our callings by conforming ourselves to some abstract moral code. We find our callings by claiming authentic selfhood. So our call, our service of the heart, cannot be forced because we can't sustain what is forced. Nor can we only serve ourselves, our own loves and desires. Our vocation, our authentic service, is where the two, the world's need and our own deep gladness, our own passion and interest, come together. The truth is that if you are inadequate to the task that you believe you are called to do, that probably means that you are on to something. The Bible is just rife with this fact. Isaac was a daydreamer. Jacob was a cheater. Peter had a temper and denied Christ. David had an affair and tried to cover it up with murder. Noah got drunk. Elisha was suicidal. Jonah ran from God. Paul was a murderer, and he was way too religious. Timothy had too many ulcers. Gideon was insecure. Miriam was a gossiper. Martha was a worrier. Thomas was a doubter. Sarah was impatient. Elijah was moody. Rahab was a prostitute. Samson, well, he liked prostitutes. Isaiah preached naked for 3 years. John the Baptist ate bugs and had second thoughts about the very Messiah he baptized. Jeremiah was way too emotional. Moses stuttered. Zacchaeus was way too short. Abraham was old. And Lazarus was dead. My problem, ultimately, when I knew I loved chaplaincy, my problem was that I kept fainting. That's the honest truth. Enough trauma and blood and gore and terror and domestic violence would, night after night with many things happening in one night, I would get so I was so afraid I would faint, that I would faint. And I could not mind over matter it, like, squeeze a pressure point like this, just tell yourself it's fine, this happens all over the world all the time. And I could not, it was the first thing in my life that I could not make better by willing it so. And I realized I had to adjust what my own understanding of call was, so to be with people and walk with them through their life, and figure out how to be authentic and real and how to love God and how to love others. That's still my sense of call. But it isn't in a hospital setting, because I kept having that happen where I would faint, and it wasn't good for the patients I was with, and it wasn't so good to hit the ground like that either. So I adjusted to being in a parish setting, and I love parish ministry, so I feel this is very close to the call. And I think our calls are determined throughout our life, and they can change over and over as we're called to different ways of being, and as we're called within and among community. Lutheran pastor Nadia Bowles-Weber writes, "Never once did Jesus scan the room for the best example of holy living and send that person out to tell others about him. He always sent stumblers and sinners," and I find that comforting. Me too, because I know I was definitely stumbling towards the utility elevator a lot of the time, just to not scare other people by fainting on them. So God doesn't call the equipped, God equips the called. And God has called First Church in Sterling to create heaven on earth. And Robin writes this: "I know what you're thinking. I will never be kind enough, holy enough, smart enough, deep enough, big-hearted enough, educated enough, healthy enough, sane enough, tough enough, connected enough, rich enough, powerful enough, generous enough, good enough. And who has time for world transformation anyways? I'm busy," she said. "I'm not even free enough." We all have a pervasive kind of spiritual imposter syndrome. Oh, I'm glad to know it's not just me. Okay. We are all just worried that we'll be exposed as the frauds that we are, right? The annoying thing about God is that God doesn't call the extra good or the extra spiritual. God just calls scrappy, banged up, brokenhearted us. Ready or not, here God comes, barging into our lives and telling us to follow. That's what our scripture is really about today, the scripture Andrew just read. The story is from Luke. It's the story of Jesus calling the 12 apostles. He doesn't go to the temple and look for a bunch of pious religious leaders. He doesn't search out the most pious students of the law. He doesn't look around for the richest and most powerful backers. He goes to the lake. A bunch of fishermen are at the shore of the lake catching fish from boats when Jesus shows up and gets in the boat with them. He says, put the nets in the water deep for a catch. And Simon Peter says, forget it, Jesus. There aren't any fish. We've been trying that. But if you say so, we will. He answers Jesus' call to mission, even though he doubts his own abilities. And their nets fill up with fish. So much fish that the nets are burdened and about to break, and they nearly do break, and they caught so many fishes that the boats were about to sink. And when Simon Peter sees this, he falls to his knees. Go away from me, God, he says to Jesus. I am a sinful man. And Jesus just tells him not to be afraid, that from now on, he would be catching people. And the apostles then leave their job as fishermen to follow Jesus, to become fishermen of men. When we steer clear of the word evangelize, it's understandable. No one really likes door knockers who try to convince us to believe like them, think like them, dress like them, reject others, and worst of all, co-opt the heart of the Christian faith. We do our best not to be a religion about Jesus, but the religion of Jesus. Here at First Church, when we talk about being part of the love revolution, this is what we mean. Following in the footsteps of Jesus, we remember that our deeds count and our words have power. Our quiet presence in the world might bring a peace of mind for someone else. That could be a powerful thing, and power can be so gentle. Our love can change everything, one person at a time. We have both the capacity and the responsibility to do our share to redeem the world, and that means that we have to find our own service of the heart. We have to figure out what it means to be fishers of men. How do we spread the love revolution? And it also means, more often than not, that we can't do it alone. God sends us one another to fish side by side until our boats overflow and there is enough for all. I leave you with a story from Japan about a man, his call, and his community. Many years ago, Tetsugen, a follower of Zen Buddhism in Japan, decided to publish the sutras. Well, the sutras are written texts about the life of Buddha in Japanese. They wanted to publish them in Japanese. They had only been written in Chinese up to then. To translate and publish these works into Japanese would be a project of great significance, the value of which would be applauded everywhere. The books were to be printed with wood blocks in an edition of 7,000 copies, a tremendous undertaking. Tetsugen began by traveling and collecting donations for this purpose. A few sympathizers would give him 100 pieces of gold, but most of the time he received only a few coins. He thanked each donor with equal gratitude. Finally, after 10 long years of begging, Tetsugen had enough money to begin his task. It happened at that time that the Uji River overflowed. Famine followed. Tetsugen took the money he had collected to publish the books, and he gave it away to save the villagers on the river from starving to death. Then he began his work again of collecting the money necessary to produce the sutras. This time it took 7 years before Tetsugen had enough money again to begin his task. But the money was barely collected before an epidemic spread across the country. Again, he gave away what he had collected to help the sick. After 20 more years of begging, he was at last able to publish the sutras in Japanese. The printing blocks that produced the first edition of sutras can still be seen today in the Obuku Monastery in Kyoto. But to this day, the Japanese tell their children that Tetsugen made 3 sets of sutras, and that the first 2 invisible sets surpass even the last one. Love in action created all 3. God doesn't call the equipped. God equips the called. And all of us are called. May it be so. Amen.